The ground is moving right now. Not in Japan, off your coast. April 20, 2026, a magnitude 7.4 to 7.7 earthquake tears open the Sanriku coast of Japan, and every headline on the planet pivots east. And then the Pacific Northwest started shaking too. 18 earthquakes in 12 hours, 250 miles off Washington. Almost no one noticed. The Cascadia subduction zone carries a 37% chance of a magnitude 7.1 or greater megathrust within the next 50 years. It last ruptured fully on January 26, 1700. That is 325 years of stored energy, still loading. 10 million people, one fault, zero warning system. The spring has been loading since 1700. The Cascadia subduction zone's geometry would later become the exact thing that defines the scale of the catastrophe waiting offshore. But in 1700, it was just a coastline nobody had mapped. Here is how a subduction zone works, and why the mechanics matter more than almost anything else you will hear about this fault. The Juan de Fuca Plate sits in the northeastern Pacific Ocean, moving eastward and diving beneath the North American Plate at roughly 40 millimeters per year. That is about the speed your fingernails grow. It sounds trivial. It is not. The critical zone is called the seismogenic coupling interface. This is the locked section of the fault, sitting between about 5 and 25 kilometers depth, where the two plates are physically stuck together. The plates want to move. The friction will not allow it. So instead of sliding, the rock deforms elastically. It bends. It compresses. It stores energy the way a spring stores energy, when you push it down and hold it there. Geophysicists call this stored energy, elastic strain. GPS networks across Oregon and Washington record the slow deformation of the land surface as the overriding North American Plate gets dragged and bent by the locked fault below. The coast is being pulled slightly eastward and downward. When the fault finally releases, that motion reverses violently. The coast springs back westward and upward in minutes. The fault does have a partial pressure release mechanism called episodic tremor and slip, or slow slip. At depths below the fully locked zone, roughly 25 to 45 kilometers down, the fault periodically creeps in slow, aseismic slip events, lasting days to weeks. These generate a low-frequency seismic signal called non-volcanic tremor, detectable by sensitive instruments but producing no shaking any human can feel. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. Here is the critical misunderstanding that needs correcting. Slow slip events do not drain the locked zone of its stored energy. The slow slip occurs below and down dip of the locked zone. What slow slip events do, mechanically, is transfer stress up dip toward the locked seismogenic zone. They are not releasing the danger, they are feeding it. That was only round one. When the lock finally breaks, the Juan de Fuca Plate lurches seaward and downward. The overriding North American Plate snaps back westward and upward. The seafloor deforms across the entire rupture length simultaneously. In a full margin Cascadia rupture, that means deformation across roughly 1,000 kilometers of fault. The vertical displacement of the seafloor, potentially several meters in seconds, displaces the entire overlying water column. That is a megathrust tsunami. It does not build gradually. It begins propagating the moment the seafloor moves. The Juan de Fuca Plate celebrated each slow slip cycle as a sign of normalcy. It shouldn't have, but this wasn't just about the fault anymore. Japan had just demonstrated exactly what happens when a subduction zone decides it is done waiting. On December 8, 2025, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake struck off the coast of northern Japan. The Japan Meteorological Agency, the JMA, issued its first elevated megaquake advisory. The warning was specific. It stated that the probability of a subsequent magnitude 8 or larger earthquake along the Nankai Trough had increased above baseline levels. Japan went into a heightened state of alert. Coastal communities reviewed evacuation routes. Emergency management agencies activated monitoring protocols. The advisory lasted for a defined period before being downgraded. But the message had been sent clearly. Subduction zones give signals. Japan has built a system designed to hear them. Then came April 20, 2026. A magnitude 7.4 to 7.7 earthquake struck the Sanriku coast of Japan, along the Japan Trench subduction zone. The JMA immediately issued warnings that the probability of a subsequent magnitude 8 or greater earthquake had become elevated for a full 1-week window following the main shock. Tsunami advisories were issued. Coastal residents in the Tohoku region, the same region devastated by the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, moved to higher ground. The global media response was immediate and intense. Every major international news organization led with the story. Social media flooded with footage, with expert commentary, with historical comparisons to the 2011 Tohoku disaster. The coverage was warranted. The Japan Trench is one of the most seismically active subduction zones on the planet. It is where the Pacific Plate dives beneath the Okhotsk Plate at a rate of roughly 80 to 90 millimeters per year. Significantly faster than the Juan de Fuca Plate's 40 millimeters per year convergence at Cascadia. The two systems are not identical. But their fundamental architecture is the same. A dense oceanic plate subducting beneath a lighter continental plate. A locked seismogenic zone accumulating elastic strain. A history of full-margin ruptures generating transoceanic tsunamis. The tectonic family resemblance is unmistakable. Here is the detail that tells the real story. Japan's entire warning infrastructure, its tiered alert system, its public education campaigns, its tsunami evacuation signage embedded into every coastal community, its mandatory earthquake drills, its hardened coastal seawalls, its real-time seismic monitoring network covering thousands of sensors. All of it exists because of what happened on March 11, 2011. The Tohoku earthquake and tsunami killed nearly 16,000 people, left over 2,500 missing, and caused an estimated $360 billion in economic damage. Japan looked at that catastrophe and built a system designed to reduce the death toll the next time. The Pacific Northwest has no equivalent system. There is no public megathrust advisory protocol for Cascadia. There is no tiered alert system that activates when seismic indicators suggest elevated probability of a large rupture. Coastal communities in Oregon and Washington have tsunami evacuation route signage, and some communities have conducted drills. But the institutional infrastructure that Japan has constructed over decades of post-Tohoku investment does not exist in comparable form along the Cascadia coastline. Japan's warning system exists because Japan paid the price to understand what it was dealing with. The Pacific Northwest has not yet paid that price. The Cascadia subduction zone has not ruptured in a full-margin event during the modern era of instrumentation, modern coastal development, or modern population density. The 1700 rupture struck a coastline populated by indigenous communities with deep knowledge of the hazard. Communities that had oral traditions describing the Great Shaking and the Great Wave. The modern cities of Portland, Seattle, Eugene, Victoria, and Vancouver did not exist. They exist now, and the fault is still loading. Just after midnight Pacific Daylight Time on April 12, 2026, seismometers operated by the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network began registering a sequence of earthquakes. The location was the Juan de Fuca Ridge, approximately 250 miles off the coast of Washington state. Over the following 12 hours, at least 18 earthquakes were recorded. The largest reached magnitude 4.2. The swarm was real, it was detectable, and it was almost entirely invisible to the public. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, known as the PNSN, is operated through the University of Washington and serves as the primary monitoring agency for seismic activity across Oregon and Washington. The network detected the swarm in real time. Harold Tobin, the director of the PNSN, addressed the event directly and clearly. The swarm, Tobin stated, posed no risk at all to people on land. That assessment was scientifically accurate, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Here is why. And here is also why the distinction matters enormously. The Juan de Fuca Ridge is a divergent plate boundary. It is the line along which the Juan de Fuca Plate and the Pacific Plate are pulling apart from each other, with new seafloor material being generated through volcanic upwelling as the gap opens. Divergent boundaries produce earthquakes through extensional stress, through the pulling apart of rock, rather than the compression and collision that characterizes a subduction zone. The Juan de Fuca Ridge sits approximately 250 miles offshore, at a location that is mechanically and geologically distinct from the Cascadia subduction zone megathrust interface. The two structures are part of the same broader tectonic system, in the sense that the Juan de Fuca Plate is born at the ridge and consumed at the subduction zone. But a swarm of earthquakes at the ridge does not directly stress or destabilize the locked megathrust interface. Tobin's assessment was not reassurance for reassurance's sake. It was a precise scientific statement about mechanical relationships between two different types of plate boundaries. The earthquakes at the ridge were not a signal that the megathrust was about to rupture, and then the broader tectonic picture made the one decision that changed everything about how to interpret April 2026 as a whole. Because the swarm did not occur in isolation. It occurred 8 days before a major subduction zone earthquake struck Japan. It occurred weeks before more than 300 tremor epicenters would be mapped across the full length of the Cascadia subduction zone. It occurred within a broader window of tectonic activity that, taken individually, each carries a benign explanation, but taken together, paints a picture of a fault system that is not dormant. It is active. It is cycling. It is doing exactly what a fault does in the years and decades before it reaches the end of its loading cycle. The swarm at the Juan de Fuca Ridge on April 12 was not the warning. Harold Tobin was right about that. But here is the problem that is not making headlines. The swarm was a reminder. It was a reminder that 250 miles off the coast of Washington, the seafloor is in constant motion. Plates are spreading. Plates are diving. Faults are slipping. Tremors are propagating. The tectonic machinery that built the Pacific Northwest coastline and that will one day violently reshape it is running continuously, invisibly, beyond the horizon where no one is watching. The April 12 swarm generated a brief news cycle. A few regional outlets covered it. Harold Tobin's reassurance was quoted accurately, and then the story disappeared, because there was nothing dramatic to show. No shaking on land, no damage, no injuries, no footage. Just 18 small earthquakes on the seafloor, 250 miles from shore, in the dark. That is exactly the kind of event that is easy to file away as nothing. The Cascadia subduction zone has been filed away as nothing for 325 years. The seafloor does not care about news cycles. The fault does not care about reassurance statements. The Juan de Fuca plate is moving at 40 millimeters per year, whether anyone is watching or not. And every millimeter of that motion is being stored in a locked zone that is not released since the night of January 26, 1700. By mid-July 2026, data from the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network told a story that demanded attention. More than 300 tremor epicenters had been mapped across nearly the entire length of the Cascadia subduction zone, not clustered in one segment, not isolated to a single region. Distributed across the full 1,000-kilometer span of the fault, from Northern California through Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia. 300 individual epicenters, spanning the entire zone simultaneously. To understand why that number matters, you need to understand what tremor is and what it is not. Non-volcanic tremor at a subduction zone is a low-frequency seismic signal generated by slow slip at the deep transition zone, the region of the fault sitting roughly 25 to 45 kilometers below the surface. This is below the fully locked seismogenic zone, where the big rupture will eventually occur. Tremor is not an earthquake in the conventional sense. It produces no surface shaking. It causes no damage. It cannot be felt by any human being standing anywhere on land. But it is not nothing. It is the acoustic signature of the fault moving at depth, of slow, aseismic slip propagating along the deep transition zone, of stress being redistributed within the fault system. And here is the mechanical consequence that matters. When slow slip occurs at the deep transition zone, it transfers stress up dip toward the locked seismogenic zone above it. The locked zone, already loaded with 325 years of accumulated elastic strain, receives additional stress from the slow slip events occurring below it. The slow slip does not relieve the locked zone. It loads it further. In some future moment, the Pacific Northwest would understand exactly what this meant. 300-plus epicenters spanning the full 1,000 kilometers of Cascadia simultaneously is a statistically notable interval. Researchers who study episodic tremor and slip have documented recurring slow slip cycles at Cascadia, with events occurring roughly every 12 to 15 months in the northern part of the zone and at varying intervals in the southern segments. The 2026 tremor activity fell within the expected pattern of episodic cycling. Individual slow-slip events at Cascadia have been studied extensively since their discovery in the early 2000s by researchers including Herb Draggart and Gary Rogers at the Geological Survey of Canada, whose work fundamentally changed the scientific understanding of how subduction zones behave between major ruptures. And somehow, it gets worse. Because the 300-plus epicenters are not in themselves the alarming finding. The alarming finding is what they confirm. They confirm that the fault is actively cycling, that the deep transition zone is moving. That stress is being redistributed within a system that is already at or near the upper end of its historical loading cycle. These are not precursors in the classical sense. Seismologists are careful about that language, and correctly so. Tremor and slow-slip events do not predict the timing of the next major rupture. They do not tell you the rupture is coming next week or next decade. What they tell you is that the fault is not sleeping. It is working. Up to this point, the Cascadia subduction zone had been quiet in the way that matters to the public. That was about to flip. There's a reason this story is still talked about today. On the evening of January 26, 1700, at approximately 9 p.m. local time, the Cascadia subduction zone ruptured along its full margin. The earthquake has been estimated at between magnitude 8.7 and 9.2, making it one of the largest seismic events in the recorded history of North America. The rupture propagated along the entire 1,000-kilometer length of the fault, from what is now Northern California to what is now British Columbia. The seafloor lurched, the coast dropped, and a tsunami began moving outward across the Pacific Ocean at the speed of a commercial jet aircraft. We know this event happened with extraordinary precision for something that occurred 325 years ago, before any seismometer existed, before any written record was kept along the Pacific Northwest coastline by the people who would later build cities there. The evidence comes from multiple independent scientific disciplines, each pointing to the same date and the same event. The first line of evidence comes from the trees. Along the coasts of Oregon and Washington, researchers have found ghost forests, stands of dead western red cedar and Sitka spruce that were killed by sudden subsidence when the coastline dropped abruptly during the 1700 rupture. The land along the coast sank by as much as 1 to 2 meters in some locations as the overriding North American plate lurched seaward and released the elastic strain it had accumulated over centuries. The trees, suddenly below the tidal zone, drowned in salt water. Their dead trunks, preserved in the anaerobic mud of coastal marshes, still stand in some locations today. Tree ring analysis of these ghost forest specimens, conducted by researchers including Brian Atwater of the United States Geological Survey, established that the trees died after the 1699 growing season and did not grow in 1700. The rupture killed them at the end of January, before the 1700 growing season began. The second line of evidence crosses the Pacific Ocean. Japanese historical records from the Sanriku coast document a tsunami that struck on the night of January 27, 1700, Japanese local time, corresponding to the evening of January 26 inches North America. The tsunami arrived with no preceding earthquake felt in Japan, which is a critical detail. It was what seismologists call an orphan tsunami, a wave that arrived without a local seismic event to explain it. The only explanation consistent with the wave's arrival time, its height, and its directionality, was a large earthquake somewhere in the eastern Pacific. Researcher Kenji Satake and colleagues worked backward from the Japanese historical records, using tsunami travel time modeling, to pinpoint the source as Cascadia and the time as approximately 9 p.m. Pacific time on January 26, 1700. The Sanriku coast of Japan, struck by the orphan tsunami of 1700, is the same coastline that was struck by the April 20, 2026 earthquake and its associated tsunami warnings. The same geography, the same tectonic relationship, the same vulnerability. The 1700 Cascadia rupture sent a wave across the Pacific that hit Sanriku. The 2026 Japan Trench earthquake sent waves toward the Pacific Northwest. The ocean connects these two subduction zones in ways that are not metaphorical, they are physical. The paleoseismic record extends far beyond the single event of 1700. Researchers studying coastal sediment cores, submarine turbidite deposits, and onshore marsh stratigraphy have identified 43 major Cascadia rupture events over the last 10,000 years. The turbidite record, studied extensively by Chris Goldfinger of Oregon State University and colleagues, documents submarine landslides triggered by major Cascadia earthquakes, with the sediment layers preserved in the deep sea canyons offshore. Each turbidite layer represents a major shaking event. 43 layers over 10,000 years yields an average recurrence interval of roughly 200 to 500 years, with significant variability between events. Some intervals were as short as 100 years, some extended to 1,000 years. The current interval is 325 years. That places the present moment within the statistical window of recurrence based on the Paleoseismic record. It does not mean the rupture is imminent. It means the rupture is not overdue in a way that allows anyone to dismiss the risk as distant. The spring has been loading for 325 years. The Paleoseismic record says the spring has released on average every 200 to 500 years. The math is not reassuring. The 1700 event was not a regional curiosity. It was a continental catastrophe that reshaped the coastline, drowned forests, and sent a killing wave across the Pacific. The only reason it is not burned into American cultural memory, the way the 1906 San Francisco earthquake is burned into California's memory, is that in 1700, the Pacific Northwest coast was not home to modern cities. The people who lived through the 1700 rupture and tsunami were the indigenous nations of the coast, including the Huayot First Nation of Vancouver Island, whose oral traditions describe a great shaking and a great flood that swept away a winter village. Their knowledge of the event predates the scientific reconstruction by centuries. They knew what the fault could do. They built their understanding of the coast around that knowledge. The modern cities built on that same coast do not have 325 years of institutional memory about what lives offshore. They have building codes, some of them updated and some of them not. They have evacuation route signs, some of them adequate and some of them not. They have seismic monitoring networks that are among the best in the world for detecting what is happening. What they do not have is the lived experience of the fault releasing. That experience is coming. The Paleoseismic record says so, with as much certainty as geology can offer. In late July 2026, a team of scientists conducting drilling operations off the Oregon coast published findings that extended the threat scenario beyond the Pacific Northwest and into territory that had not been widely discussed in public discourse about Cascadia. The research addressed the question of dynamic triggering. Specifically, whether a full-margin Cascadia rupture could dynamically trigger a second large earthquake on California's San Andreas Fault. Dynamic triggering is a documented seismic phenomenon. When a large earthquake ruptures, it radiates seismic waves outward in all directions. Those waves travel through the crust and can interact with other faults that are already critically stressed, meaning faults that are close to their failure threshold. The passing seismic waves can provide the additional stress increment needed to push a critically stressed fault over the edge and into rupture. The triggering earthquake does not need to be geographically close to the triggered fault. Dynamic triggering has been documented over distances of thousands of kilometers in some cases. The 1992 Landers earthquake in California triggered seismicity as far away as Yellowstone. The San Andreas Fault last ruptured in its northern segment during the Great Earthquake of April 18, 1906. That rupture produced a magnitude estimated between 7.7 and 7.9, destroyed San Francisco, and killed an estimated 3,000 people. The 1906 rupture is now 119 years in the past. The average recurrence interval for large northern San Andreas ruptures, based on paleoseismic research at sites including Pallet Creek, studied by Carrie C. of the California Institute of Technology, is roughly 100 to 200 years. The San Andreas, like Cascadia, is within its statistical recurrence window. The Oregon drilling findings raised the scenario of a compound event. A full-margin Cascadia rupture at magnitude 9.0 or greater would radiate seismic waves of enormous energy across the entire western portion of the North American continent. Those waves would reach the San Andreas Fault within minutes. If the San Andreas is critically stressed at the time of a Cascadia rupture, the dynamic triggering mechanism could push it into failure. The researchers were careful about probabilistic language. They were not claiming the compound scenario is certain or even highly probable as a simultaneous event. They were documenting that the mechanical pathway exists and that it cannot be dismissed. The implications of the compound scenario are significant enough to require explicit statement. A Cascadia magnitude 9.0 rupture alone would produce ground shaking across Oregon and Washington lasting 3 to 5 minutes, generate a tsunami reaching the Oregon coast in as little as 15 to 20 minutes, and collapse a significant fraction of the built infrastructure in the region. Add a dynamically triggered San Andreas rupture at magnitude 7.5 to 8.0, occurring within minutes to hours of the Cascadia event, and you have simultaneous infrastructure collapse across the entire western seaboard. Emergency response resources that would normally flow from California to the Pacific Northwest in a Cascadia-only scenario would instead be consumed by a concurrent California catastrophe. Mutual aid, the foundational assumption of large-scale disaster response in the United States, would be unavailable. Both regions would be responding alone, simultaneously, to the largest seismic events in their modern histories. The drilling findings were published. They received coverage in scientific and some general media outlets. They did not generate the sustained public attention that the scale of the scenario warrants. They were filed, like the April 12 swarm, like the 300-plus tremor epicenters, like the Japan Trench earthquake advisory, in the category of concerning but not immediately actionable. The fault does not share that filing system. Now, the Cascadia subduction zone could have stopped at being a regional hazard. It didn't. The numbers that define a full-margin Cascadia rupture are not abstract. They are specific, they are sourced, and they are worth sitting with individually. Ground shaking duration in a magnitude 9.0 or greater event, 3 to 5 minutes. That is not a typo. 3 to 5 minutes of continuous violent ground motion. A typical large earthquake, a magnitude 6.5 or 7.0, produces strong shaking for 20 to 40 seconds. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake shook Japan for approximately 6 minutes. A full Cascadia rupture falls in that same category. Read that again. 3 to 5 minutes. Not 30 seconds. Not 90 seconds. 3 to 5 minutes of shaking at that intensity does not leave structures standing that were not specifically designed to survive it. It does not leave bridges intact. It does not leave water mains unbroken. It does not leave port facilities operational. Tsunami arrival time at the Oregon coast, as little as 15 to 20 minutes after rupture. This is the number that most directly determines the human death toll in coastal communities. 15 minutes is not enough time for a disorganized evacuation of a coastal town. It is barely enough time for people who are already aware, already moving, and already know where to go. People who are asleep, who are in buildings that have just been severely damaged by 3 to 5 minutes of shaking, who do not know the evacuation routes, who are trying to locate family members, who are injured, face a 15 to 20 minute window to reach high ground before a wave arrives. FEMA's Cascadia rising exercise projections estimate up to 13,000 deaths and 27,000 injuries in a full margin event. Those figures are based on modeling that accounts for time of day, population distribution, and existing infrastructure conditions. They are not worst-case speculation. They are planning estimates derived from the best available data. Infrastructure losses in Oregon alone are estimated at up to $32 billion in direct damages. The Interstate 5 corridor, the primary transportation spine of the Pacific Northwest, includes bridges that have been rated as seismically deficient. In a full-margin Cascadia event, significant portions of I-5 would be impassable. Supply chains, emergency vehicle routing, and population evacuation would all depend on infrastructure that the shaking would destroy. The 37% probability figure for a magnitude 7.1 or greater Cascadia rupture within the next 50 years comes from the paleoseismic record of 43 events over 10,000 years. It is not a prediction. It is a probability. And 37% over 50 years is roughly the probability of rolling a 1 or 2 on a 6-sided die. You would not build a house on a foundation with a 37% chance of catastrophic failure over the next 50 years and then not reinforce it. The fault is within its window. The infrastructure is within its vulnerability. The population is within its exposure zone. Every year that passes without a rupture is not evidence that the risk is decreasing. It is evidence that the spring is still loading. State officials acknowledge the surface quiet of the Cascadia zone masks ongoing deep tectonic coupling offshore. The bridges are still rated deficient. The hospitals are still exposed. The 15-minute clock does not start until the ground moves. and the ground is going to move.